Hello, my name is Denise Lindeman, and I'm one of the members here at Desert Grace. I'm excited to share this Sunday message with you. Would you take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel? And if you like this video, be sure to give us a thumbs up so that we know you've been blessed. You can do those things below.
To have confidence is to have certainty and trust. Like you probably had some confidence that at 10:30 in the morning, if you showed up at this place, or if you went online and logged in, you would find a church service produced by Desert Grace Community Church of the Nazarene, which is a community moving forward on a journey toward God. You probably had a pretty good idea that's what was going to happen. And most of us have confidence in lots of things, and not that we necessarily think that confidence is bad, but to have confidence is merely to have certainty and to have trust. Certainty and trust. You know, there is a certain amount of security coming from knowing that you can count on someone or count on something. So sometimes you have somebody in your life that you know that you can pick up the phone and talk to them at any time. And when you call, they'll answer, and you will be feeling better by the time it's over. You probably have somebody like that in your life. There are certain things that we generally know we can count on. Now, occasionally, those things will let us down. Even the person may not always be available at the moment we call. And sometimes I think of things like your car, where 900 out of 901 times you turn the key and it starts. But what happens the one time when it doesn't? But you have confidence generally when you walk out to your car that it's going to start. Now, I realize that's not true for everybody in every situation, but I'm just saying most of us, that's where we're at. There is an amount to which we desire confidence in most situations. For example, you want to have confidence in the pilot that's flying your airplane. Amen. You would not want to get on the airplane and get buckled in, and you start rolling back from the gate, and the pilot says, "Attention passengers, just wondering, is there anybody on the plane that's flown one of these before? I'm not sure what one of these buttons does." That would definitely cause you to lose your confidence, right? But generally, you get on the plane, you make sure that, the pilot looks like he belongs, he's in the uniform, he's pushing all the buttons in the cockpit like he knows what he's doing. Half of them probably don't do anything, but he's looking like he knows what he's doing. Without that, we would have an issue. There are times, though, when our confidence is misplaced. When we should have confidence or not have confidence, but we have it anyway. Or we should have confidence in one thing, but we put it in another. There's times when we sort of mess that up. I've thought about this. You might place your confidence in somebody's abilities to complete a certain task. You might call, say, a plumber over to your house. And you have confidence, because they are a plumber, that they will be able to fix the leak. And then see them fail, and in the meantime go, well, here's your bill. I didn't do anything that helped you, but here's the bill. You ever had that happen? Maybe you have sometime in your life been convinced about something that you knew was a fact. And it can be anything, right? Usually it's not something too terribly important, but you are absolutely 100% sure that this is a fact, and then somebody proves you wrong. Ever been confident in a fact when somebody showed you that you were wrong? Yeah, it never happened to me either. But that was just something that you could think about, right? Yeah, some of you aren't even paying attention. It's all right. This is going to be a long day. I'm just going to say that right now. Anyway. It's entirely possible to be confident in an object only to realize it's not as great as you think it is. We have to be careful about this. The challenge of placing our confidence, our trust in something or someone is in part to how we see the situation. You don't have to look too much around the world to start to begin to realize that there are differences of opinion on who you can trust and who you cannot trust, or what brand of car is better, and which one you can plan on being reliable, which one maybe not so much. Hey, you can take it down to anything, even from the restaurant around the corner, whether they are trustworthy and whether you can give them the confidence that you are going to enjoy your meal, or whether you're not really sure. It's how we see the situation, and that's important for us to remember. Because this morning we are going to talk about Israel's overconfidence in light of the successful battle at Jericho. The question that I have for us today is, what do we learn from Israel's overconfidence after that battle? The challenge that we are faced with is that so far in the book, we have more or less seen the Israelites trust in God. Yahweh has been at the center of everything that they have done all this time. And when you get to the Battle of Jericho and you begin to see what's going on there can be no question that God was active. And when God is active, we begin to get confident in God. Hopefully. We've been going through the book of Joshua. We began with his appointment as leader over Israel. We see God in that, God putting his confidence in Joshua. We see the people putting their confidence into Joshua as God's appointed leader. You see the confidence, the way this is going. We then saw a couple of spies go in and be saved by the prostitute Rahab. Remember something. She puts her confidence in God that she will be rescued at the time of the battle. And the spies put their confidence in her that they will escape, that she will keep them hidden, and that they will be okay. We've been through the Jordan River and on dry ground, and where is our confidence? It can only be in God, and that we are doing exactly as God wants us to do. That this is the moment. This is the way it's supposed to be. And then there is no greater show of confidence than to be consecrated and prepared by God for God's purposes. We saw that too. And then last week, the Battle of Jericho, success that God gives them over that city. They're finally going to be able to inhabit the land. It's an exciting moment of confidence, and it brings us to today's episode. Yeah. Which, as I've already alluded to, might have something to do with a little bit of overconfidence. Where do we go next? Joshua chapter 7. We're going to read the first 15 verses. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, to the east of Bethel, and he told them, "Go up and spy out the region." So the men went up and spied out Ai. When they returned to Joshua, they said, "Not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and do not weary the whole army, for only a few people live there." So about 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far down to the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there until evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If we had only been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? The Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord chooses shall come forward, clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come forward, family by family. And the family the Lord chooses shall come forward, man by man. Whoever is caught with the devoted things shall be destroyed by fire, along with all that belongs to him. He has violated the covenant of the Lord, and he has done an outrageous thing in Israel." Ouch. You see, we are so excited, and we are ready to watch them bulldoze the next city. There's not too many people up there. We're good to go. Just send part of the army. Let everybody else rest. This is so much. And then you begin to realize that in the midst of this, when everything goes bad, you have Joshua face first in front of the ark saying, "Lord, why did you bring us here just to kill us?" Does that sound familiar?
Yep.
Like maybe from a book that's a few books before this one, that I might mention once in a while when I'm preaching. Possibly somewhere in Exodus you have this same sort of thing. And when you begin to realize that what's going on here is that they've kind of gone right back into the pattern when we just thought it finally was done. No, I didn't read the rest of the chapter to you, but basically it says what God said for them to do, they did. Probably by casting lots, they figured out it was the tribe of Judah and started going down until they found, which you already knew from the very first verse, that it was Achan. What do we do with all this? At the end, he and his whole entire family are put to death. By the way, if you want to see what happens next, now that it's all better, same time, same station, 1 week from today. Chapter 8. Here's the problem. Israel, even with the memory of God's victory at Jericho, becomes unfaithful. In other words, they see God's hand at work, doing exactly what God does best. And you would think they would sit back and go, "Lord, take us to the next place." And instead, they're like, "Okay, God, we've got this. We're good. We're right where we're supposed to be." You have a couple of events here, but the one that sort of becomes the center of things is this whole thieving of the devoted items. I want you to think about it for a minute. That if those belong to God, guess what? When we steal them, we basically say we want to be like God, which is the same thing that happened back in the Garden of Eden, and repeats the pattern. They become unfaithful to what God has said. They become unfaithful to, "Look, this is what I want you to do." And guess what? When you are unfaithful to God's commands, you are unfaithful to your relationship with God. Amen. So that when God says this is what you ought to do, when you don't do it, you do not honor the relationship that you have with Him. And that relationship is with Him as your God. and you as the servant. Sometimes I'm wondering if Israel got that backwards, because I look around today and I see sometimes where, well, we would never get it backwards, but I want to point something out here, because this passage is kind of a hard passage. It seems like the problem is with Achan primarily, but the whole community suffers from it. And I want to make sure we get this clear. Israel's relationship with God is as a community, not as individuals. We live in a time and in a place, and our modern minds think in one way alone, and that is that you or me are responsible for us. That when we gather together as a community of Jesus Christ, it's not so much that we are called as togetherness as we are called to do our own individual thing. Which is why when God says, this is what I want you to do, and somebody else says, I believe this is what God is calling us to do, our first response most of the time is to say, well, thank you, Pastor, for suggesting such. I'm going to go pray about it right now. And I'll come back when God speaks to me directly and tells me whether to do it or not. Which, by the way, your pastor knows that's a polite no. Okay? When you say, well, I'll pray about that, you might as well just go, yeah, no, Pastor. Thanks anyway for asking. You see, the challenge is this. We would say something like this: this church does not rise or fall on any one person. That's true. It requires all of us. It requires the community. If you look at even the financial need we're looking at, we need $20,000 in the next few months to kind of make things the way they need to be. And if you look at that, any one of us, it's going to be almost impossible. But if we all commit to praying about it, what will happen? You see, my confidence isn't in any one of you to give. My confidence is that we will all pray together, and that as a community, God will provide. Amen. You see, there's the challenge. Because if we begin to look at what happens inside this community as that we are individuals moving inside of it, we will miss the point of this whole passage. And by the way, we'll miss the point of the fact that we are part of God's people. And I don't just mean Desert Grace people or Nazarene people or Christian people. We are part of God's community. It's important that we get that. God hasn't come to us and said, I pick you to be a part of this. Without you, I can't do it. God calls you to enter into a community, not to enter in as a single individual that is just merely going about your own business. That's so important for us to understand. It was extremely true of back then. You see, the promise that was given to Israel, it was given to Abraham that a community would be the reality. Not that, hey, Abraham, you'll have some kids and some of them will do very well. No. As a community, you will be called my people. As a community, you will go to the land that I will show you, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where I will be present with you. Woo-hoo! Not, well, I'm going to let some people in and some people will stay out. Not if you're young enough or bright enough or cool enough or whatever. You see, there's times when I think we begin to see the church that way. I'll admit to having been guilty of sometimes thinking, well, I'm not cool enough to do this, or I'm not hip enough, or oh, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not whatever enough. And God says, no, I didn't call just individuals. I called you all to gather together and be the community. Which means I don't have to do everything, which is great. But it also means that when God makes his covenant with Israel, he makes it with the entire community. And he expects the entire community to uphold it. The entire community. You see the formation of Israel as a nation and the promise of this land and the promise of this presence. It's not for one of them, it's for all of them. It's not just for the best and the brightest and the most powerful. It's for the least as well. In fact, you hear words somewhere along those lines from somebody who comes way after Joshua but is in that line. Somebody named, Jesus. He says things like, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. You see, the presence that is promised isn't a presence that, look, I like you, God says, I like you, so I'll hang with you, but the person over here, they're kind of annoying. I'm not going to hang with them. The expectation of obedience, the expectation of faithfulness is on everybody, even if they don't like it. Why? Because we are the nation of Israel. We will act like God's people. We will do what God says. We are going to let our lives follow what God wants us to do, even if it means 40 years of wandering in the desert, and even if it means that we have to be circumcised, and if we have to celebrate the Passover, and if we have to march around the city and not quite sure what's going to happen. It's obedience and faithfulness. You see, part of what's going on here is there's a contract between the people of Israel as a group and God himself. A covenant is a contract, right? We have things called like CC&Rs. What's the first one? Covenants, commitments and restrictions, or something like that. A real estate person would know better than I do. But the reality is that we have these sorts of contracts today. God's got his end. He will protect, he will fight for, he will deliver to the Israelites the land he has promised them. That's his end of the bargain. And in case you didn't know, God is exceptional at making his end of the bargain happen. The people will be faithful to God's commands and only God's commands. God's commands may come through Joshua because God has appointed Joshua to be the speaker. But that's where it's coming from. That's where it's centered on. But when you live in community, any unchecked sin in an individual implicates the entire community as unfaithful. And now in the scripture passage that we looked at today, it's sort of obvious, right? The issue is Achan. I think if I was one of the other Israelites, I would be like, oh yeah, I didn't even ever like Achan. That's what we do today, right? We knew he should never be in the community. We figured that when it came time for him to come across the Jordan, God would just let the water wash him away. No one liked him ever. It's the way we act today. But when Achan does the one bad thing, the entire community is implicated. This would be true today, too. If any one of us as a community of believers were to do something that was absolutely sinful, other people might look and go, oh, that church. Thought about this. Is it possible that Achan was able to be unfaithful without anyone knowing? If you read the rest of the chapter, even though I was preaching, you saw that he took like a nice garment and some silver and some gold and maybe some bronze. Did he do this totally undetected? He buried it in his tent. Did he do this without anyone noticing? I'm not sure that's possible. I'm not sure that it's possible for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is sometimes when we are involved in sin, we become a little bit distant because we want to hide it. You know what I'm saying? We become embarrassed even though people may not know. You see, the truth is that the sin of anyone in a specific community then contaminates the entire community. Here's the bad news about that. Because it means within our church that if we allow sin to go unchecked, guess what happens? We are all then contaminated. Whoa. Things just got real. Things just got serious. How do we deal with such a thing? How do you make sure that sin doesn't go unchecked? I'm not a big proponent of saying, hey, I know God needs to work on you, but I can tell that you're sinning, so until you can get yourself all fixed up, leave. I don't think Jesus was about that. I'm going to talk a little more about this, because sin is contagious. If we don't call out sin as sin, it becomes normal. And when it becomes normal, that means that sin or separation from God is the condition. So we begin to start to maybe understand a little bit like why God would say, look, the problem here is with Achan. And we need to deal something with Achan so that the community will be restored the way it's supposed to be, because otherwise, the next time God does something incredible, somebody else will go in and take the devoted things. And pretty soon, it's just going to be normal. One of the things that has fascinated me in the church world is that if you have any kind of event and you have centerpieces, people think that they're free gifts. Once upon a time, when you put a centerpiece out, if somebody really liked it, they would start asking around if they could have one. Now you put them out and people just help themselves. Do you see what I'm saying? The sin of Achan is exposed by the sin of Israel. I don't want to say the sin of Israel is exposed by the sin of Achan. I think it's the other way around. That in a sense, maybe Achan is somewhat of a scapegoat here. Because God is very angry with Israel. Interesting thing. You see, during the first verse of chapter 7, God is angry because Israel has sinned against him, so God exits the picture. But Israel continues to move forward as though God is still present and in charge. Did you catch that?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, right? Israel goes over to Ai expecting to conquer it on its own strength. Look at how great we were at Jericho. We just walked around 7 times and then 7 times more on the last day, and woohoo! The walls just came tumbling down, and whoo. This time, all we got to do is we don't even have to send the whole army. This is going to be so easy. It's going to be, there's like not even that many people there. I love this because first, Joshua sends spies. We've seen this before, right? Joshua sends spies. The first time they come back and they go, oh, everybody is fearful, but we really didn't see anything because guess what? We got there and right away we got caught at the prostitute's house. Now he sends spies again. And the spies say, hey, only a few people live there. We'll let everyone rest. Send the worst troops over there because this is going to be a cakewalk. Joshua sends only a portion of the warriors, and there's some talk about this 2,000 to 3,000 men. Would that be an accurate number? Scholars really sort of question whether or not that would be a correct number. In fact, they would say that they believe that number is probably inflated by 10 times, that he probably only sent 200 or 300. And when you figure out that only like 36 or so people died, maybe it was only a couple hundred people. You begin to see some things going on under the text, because the Israelites get soundly defeated. This isn't like, hey, we fought valiantly. If we'd had another couple hundred guys, we'd have been fine. And the impression that you get is they go up to the city gates, and about the time they get to the city gates, somebody goes, "Intruders!" And then this whole army comes chasing them. Maybe even in tanks, I don't know. Chasing them down past the quarry and whatever else, and then about 36 of them died. Like, this isn't just like a little defeat. For the first time in the book, there's these deaths recorded. I mean, we've seen them in 2 battles now, right? In the first one, there's nothing about anyone even skinning a kneecap, springing an ankle on one of the fallen stones. We get here, about 36 of them died. Imagine coming back, expecting that you were going to have this easy defeat, or you were easily going to defeat them, and you come back and go, "We were easily defeated, and we've lost 36 of our community." Seems to me like there's a point being made, because after all, this is not a history book, it is a theology book. You might have heard that once or twice if you've been with us all 7 weeks now. No matter how big the army is, no matter how small the army is, it's never going to be enough if Yahweh is not involved. Sometimes I wonder, is it that Yahweh says, "All right, fine, you big britches, go look and see what you can see." And they go and they look, and suddenly they realize that, oh, there's hardly any people here. And God's like, "Yeah, that's because they're all hiding. They saw you coming. You tipped them off. When you send back the army, they're going to be ready. You're going to be outnumbered." Maybe God allowed that to happen because he wanted them to see, you need me. You don't have it on your own. It's so interesting to me that Israel, rather than her enemies, finds their own hearts melting in fear. If you remember, every time up to this point, it's never been Israel's hearts melting in fear. It's always been somebody else melting. Yeah. It's the exact same words used of the people of Jericho. More than once. Now, instead of Ai being the ones melting in fear because God is coming, Israel is melting in fear, worried that God has brought them out so that he could kill them. Kind of an interesting concept. It's the opposite of how things were before, but it's also the opposite of how Yahweh intends for them to be. This is the land flowing with milk and honey. It's the promised land. God is a God who obeys and follows his covenant, and this is how it's ending? Rather than Ai being God's enemy, Israel has become it. Think about that for a minute. Rather than you being God's friend, have you ever been his enemy? Without Yahweh, Israel looks remarkably like the inhabitants of the land. The very people they came because of the ban. God said, get rid of them. They're not faithful. And when they walk away from their relationship, they look just like everyone else. There's a major lesson for us in there. You see, God called them to be the hand of judgment. Now they are the ones under that very judgment. Rather than enjoying everything that God has to offer, they're fearful about what might happen next. Joshua falls on his face in humility rather than worship in order to seek the Lord. Now, I wanted to make sure we get this. You have seen Joshua fall to his feet, fall on his face in front of God before. You just didn't read it in church. You read it when you were at home after the sermon. The end of chapter 5, you have this whole thing with a divine warrior, and at that point he goes on his face and he is just worshiping God. Now he is on his face, he is lamenting what has happened, and he is calling on God to do God's part. He says, "Hey God, we had a deal and you need to fulfill it." He used slightly different words. He called on God to be God. But that's essentially what he was saying. You're supposed to do your part. Joshua is operating at this point out of a human perspective. He's all emotional. His heart is one of the hearts that is melting in fear, because he has left God out of the most important thing he needs to do. And it seems to me like this. Joshua doesn't ever appear to seem to recognize that Israel might be at fault. It never crosses his mind, because you don't see him fall on his face in humility and say, "Lord, what have we done? Show me and we will correct it." He says, "God, you be God. Give us this land. Why are we here otherwise?" Joshua says something about, then what will happen if our name is wiped off the earth? Then what will you have, God? Because the Israelites won't be here anymore. And he forgets that Israel is named by God. They have their name because of God. God doesn't have his name because of Israel. Think about it for a minute. I do want to say that calling out to God, no matter what reasoning, no matter what we say, is the appropriate response. When things seem to be going really bad, things seem to be really a struggle, calling out to God is how you do it. And in fact, when he does this and he tells God what he thinks God ought to be doing, Yahweh calls on Joshua and he says, "Correct your posture." In other words, stand up. Why are you laying down on the floor? Listen up, get ready. I'm about to give you instructions, and you're going to carry them out. And you can't carry them out on the floor, face down. Unfaithfulness brought this on. Not God's unfaithfulness, your unfaithfulness. I can almost see Joshua's jaw drop. Kidding? It's us? And the only way to resolve the issue is to ban Achan. Now, God doesn't say it quite that directly. I'll show you who it is what God tells him to. But the only way to resolve is to do it. As a result, that's what gets carried out. At the very end, they burn Achan and his entire family. His children, the one person that's not mentioned is his wife. She's just not mentioned. Sons and daughters, Achan, all the stuff that he owns, it's all burnt. First they get stoned, then burnt. And God turns from his anger. What does this mean? What is this all about? In a very real sense, the offending family's removal puts the community back to a faithful status. I don't know about you, but I really struggle with that. That Achan, but not only Achan who did the deed, but his whole family gets put to death. And most likely because it's the family who was probably very much aware that in the middle of their tent was a new fresh hole that somebody had dug, and they knew who had dug it and might have even had some part of doing it. But they all pay the ultimate price. We don't act this way. God doesn't operate this way today. So, what do we learn from Israel's overconfidence after the successful battle at Jericho? We didn't learn that if someone in our midst is sinning, we should stone them and burn them and their family with them. That's one thing we didn't learn. We didn't learn to say, oh yeah, well, I'll pray for you, and then just go do nothing. We learn from Israel's overconfidence the value of relationship with God. Here's going to be my guess. The times when you struggled the most with something that you did that separated you from God, you didn't talk to God first, or you did something exactly what He told you not to do. Perhaps it was a careless error, or perhaps it was, God, I know you probably won't be happy with me doing this, but I'm going to give it a try and see what happens. And then we get routed and we go, well, God, why didn't you do your part? Protect me from my own stupidity. In the Battle of Jericho, the fight is over as quickly as it begins. Why? Because God was there. Joshua didn't say, hey, let's go take the city. God said, here, it's time. Here's how it's going to go down. The Battle of Ai, the Israelites, they're chased some distance and deaths occur. Not because God is looking the other way, because He was negligent. He was never invited to begin with. God never withdrew from Israel, but Israel pressed on without Him. Where in your life have you moved on without God? Where God's presence is what dictates whether you were successful or close to Him, and you said, I'll just keep going and see what happens. The relationship is too valuable to keep moving on. Where does your faith relationship need reunification with Him? Because sometimes I think we are so good at compartmentalizing that some parts of our lives are really close to God. Sunday morning at 10:30. Thursday afternoon at 2, maybe not so much. Have you moved ahead without God? And where would your relationship with God need a reunification with Him? I'll be honest with you, we should know better than to fight battles without God. I think it's true in the church. I think it's true in our own lives. It's definitely true as a community. We learn from Israel's overconfidence the value of obedience to God. Relationship leads to faith. Good, strong relationship will help you to be obedient, just so we're all on the same page. It's important that we recognize this. It was a lack of faith that leads to the lack of obedience. The lack of obedience led to the destruction. Whether you want to talk about the 36 killed or just Achan's family, mind you, everyone would have mourned all of those events. It was a community of faith. Because of the string of victories for Israel, they began to see themselves higher than they ought to have seen themselves. Thankfully, none of us have ever struggled with this. We have never been tempted to take what God has done for us as our own ability. Give it a try. See what happens. God will say, oh, you've got this? Watch. And He sits back with his popcorn. See how this ends up. Where are we doing exactly what Achan did? Or as a community, what Israel did? Where are those places? Are you obedient to God in all things, whether they're really big and important, or whether they're little baby things He's asked you to do? Are you obedient? We learn from Israel's overconfidence the value of a community of faith. I want to make sure we get this straight. None of us is in this alone. None of us can do anything that doesn't affect one another. We are together. The Christian community in particular, it's dependent on its members to be faithful. Now, I could go down a whole laundry list of things here. Faithful to serve God in however He's called you to serve Him. Faithful to give as God has called you to give. Faithful to reach out to others as God has called you to reach out to others. How about this one? It's a really big one. Faithful to pray in all things. But I'm also wondering if some of it is to be faithful to one another by mentioning the things to one another that we worry might be causing sin in a community. You see, perhaps part of the problem is we've lost some of our interconnectedness because we feel like we only affect ourselves. But any sin in your life affects me. It affects us as community. We affect each other, which means that my sin affects you as well. What are you contributing to the community? Are you ushering God's presence in, or are you bringing unholiness into it? I said that a little clumsy, so I'm going to say it again. There should have been a whole bunch of amens. Are you ushering God's presence into the community?
Amen. Yep. Amen.
Or are you bringing unholiness within?
Amen.
This is a promised land. It's for all of us. It is present now. I want to make sure you understand, we live in the promised land.
Yep. Amen. Right.
And I don't talk about the United States here. I'm talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is here now. Not maybe fully as we really are excited about it, but it's here now. We are a community. We are the citizens of that kingdom.
Yep.
Are you bringing it joy? Or are you causing God to step away? How confident are you today? My fear is that some of us might be overconfident. Some of us might be underconfident. And if you're like me, I've been working through this passage for a while now. And I still would tell you I have more questions than answers about how to live it out. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for even the difficult scriptures. The scriptures that at sometimes we want to just sort of gloss over. Skip this page, Lord. Because either it talks about something we really don't want to talk about, where Israel is considered unfaithfulness. Or there's a couple of verses in there where it's specific that Achan is the one that has done this, but you have said in your word that it's Israel that has sinned. It is Israel that has brought this upon them. It is Israel, it is Israel, it is Israel, and you never say it is Achan. And when we think about that, we wonder, what are we bringing to this community? How are we representing you? So, Lord, let us not be overconfident in thinking that we're able to do this in our own power, in our own way. But give us wisdom. That as we step out of this service, as we log off the computer, would you still speak to us and point out the things that we need to do better so that we would be in right relationship with you and right relationship with this community. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for watching this sermon with me. If you enjoyed your time with us, we'd invite you to join us in person for a service. Visit us at desertgrace.org or give us a call at 928-305-1132 for more information.